This event series that we've started about science and philosophy basically started as out of a brainstorming session in which several people involved in the organization were talking about how advances in science are shaping conversations on what we traditionally consider as philosophical discussions. As you might know, for instance, Sam Harris wrote a book about how advancing cognitive science is influencing our discussions on morality. So we had this broad conversation, and we thought about, well, what if we paired scientists and philosophers for discussions about these things and focused on certain subjects that were philosophical in nature, but are amenable to empirical inquiry, or at least supposedly influenced by empirical inquiry. So we had our first one in February. It was on consciousness. And tonight's event will be on free will. And I think we've put together a really spectacular panel, so I'm going to announce them and then turn the mic over so we can get started. Here are tonight's speakers. And the order actually in which I have this on the sheet is different than the way in which you're sitting. So all the way to my left, Alfred Mele. Alfred Mele is a professor of philosophy at Florida State University, where he specializes in irrationality, intentionality, and the philosophy of action. He received his doctorate in philosophy from the University of Michigan in 1979 and was previously a professor of philosophy at Davidson College. He's also director of a 4-year project called the Big Questions in Free Will Project, aimed at furthering the public's understanding of free will. You can find more on that at freewillandscience.com. Next to Professor Mele is Hakwan Lau. Hakwan Lau is a cognitive neuroscientist at Columbia University. He works on the question of what accounts for the difference between sensory processing of which we are aware and sensory processing of which we are not aware. He previously worked at the Wellcome Center of Neuroimaging in London and did his doctorate at Oxford as a Rhodes Scholar. He was born and raised in Hong Kong, where he studied philosophy as an undergrad. I'm going to skip one. Adina Roskies, for good reason. Adina Roskies is a professor of philosophy at Dartmouth College. She received her PhD in neuroscience and cognitive science at the University of California, San Diego, and a PhD in philosophy at MIT. Her research interests lie at the intersection of philosophy and neuroscience and include the philosophy of mind, philosophy of science, and ethics. Next to Adina is Jesse Prinz. Jesse is a distinguished professor of philosophy at the City University of New York, where he works on the philosophy of psychology, philosophy of mind, cognitive science, and consciousness. He also teaches at the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill. He's the author of several books, including The Emotional Construction of Morals, and the forthcoming book, Beyond Human Nature, How Culture and Experience Shape the Human Mind. Now, as I said, there was good reason why the person in the middle was going last. Massimo Pigliucci is your moderator for tonight. So he's going to take over from me, and I'll get to sit back and listen to the conversation in hand. Massimo Pigliucci is the chair of the philosophy department at Lehman College and a professor at the City University of New York Graduate Center of Philosophy. He was previously a professor of ecology and evolution at State University of New York, Stony Brook, and his work is concerned with the philosophy of science and the relationship between science and religion. He pens the Rationally Speaking blog and hosts the podcast by the same name. His most recent book is Nonsense on Stilts, How to Tell Science from Bunk. Hopefully we'll get to do that tonight. Ladies and gentlemen, Massimo Pigliucci and your panel.
Thanks, Michael. Thanks, everybody, for coming, despite the marathon obstacles, which I'm sure has affected some people at least. It affected me today. You might have noticed that we have 3 philosophers and a half and 1.5 scientists on this panel. That may have had something to do with the fact that I was helping Michael organizing this thing. But after all, it is reflective of the field. Philosophers have been thinking about free will for almost 2.5 millennia. Scientists have come into the field in the last 15 years. So actually, we should have 50 philosophers and 1 scientist to maintain the ratio. The way we're going to do this, as Michael pointed out, is we're going to start a conversation for the next half an hour, 40 minutes or so, and which hopefully is going to give you food for thought. And then you can start thinking about those 15, 20 seconds questions that Michael was referring to. So my first question is going to be doing the first round for Adina. And in particular, you wrote a paper or published a paper last year that was called "How Does Neuroscience Affect Our Conception of Volition?" Which I actually thought was one of the best papers in that field that I've read in a long time. But I wanted to ask a specific question about that paper because that, I think, will get the discussion started. You say that the absence of a clear concept of volition, which is what some neurobiologists and psychologists refer to as what philosophers call free will, complicates the task of investigating experimentally. And then you also say that some neuroscientists seem to think that neuroscientific work is able to illuminate the truth or falsity of things like determinism, free will, and so on. You seem to be skeptical about those attempts, at least to some extent. Why?
Well, I certainly think that the question of determinism is not something that neuroscience is going to give us an answer to. And I actually wrote a little bit about that in a paper in Ticks, where I argued that anything that at the level at which neuroscientists look at the brain, anything that appears to be, let's say, indeterministic, could be underlaid by more microscopic organization of mechanisms that are in fact deterministic and just appear to be indeterministic, and that there's no real handle that you can get on this question of determinism through looking at the brain itself. So
now, why is the question of determinism relevant at all to what we're talking about?
So I think it's a good question because I think throughout the history of philosophy, people have thought that this question of free will hinges, at least in part, on whether or not determinism is true. So you might think if everything that happens because it's due to, let's say, the initial state of the universe and the laws of nature, which is essentially what determinism would mean, then nothing that we can do is really a choice or is really free. We couldn't have done otherwise. And so all of the things that we think of as comprising freedom and free will seem to be undercut by determinism. Historically, philosophers have thought about the question of free will largely in terms of the question of determinism. And there's a pretty vibrant trend in philosophy or view in philosophy right now that really it doesn't matter whether or not determinism is true. There are other ways to account for free will, and that's certainly the position I would take on the matter.
Okay, my next question actually is sort of a follow-up on that, and that's to Al. So you published a book in 2009 called Effective Intentions, The Power of Conscious Will. And one of the things you did in that book was to take to task on critical grounds a number of claims that have been made in the scientific literature about free will. You point out that neurobiologists write a lot about consciousness, the brain, and free will, and all that sort of stuff. But in fact, that a lot of these claims are, let's say, shaky on empirical grounds and or conceptual grounds. Would you mind elaborating on that for a few minutes?
Oh, yeah, I can do that. It's a whole book I'd be talking about, but it's a short book. So I don't do anything fancy philosophically in that book. What I do is to look at the data that are generated by various experiments and then look at whether the data actually justify the claims that the scientists make based on the data. So I'd actually have to explain experiments to let you know what I do in that book. I'll explain one.
Sure.
Do I have time to do that? So the set of experiments that really got the no free will ball rolling in science were done by Benjamin Libet. He was a neurobiologist. He died just a couple of years ago. And it's really fascinating work. So what subjects were supposed to do was just flex a wrist whenever they wanted, and they were watching a very fast clock, and there's a dot that just whips around the clock. It makes a complete revolution in about 2.5 seconds. They're hooked up to two machines, so you get EEG readings from the scalp, and then there's an electromyograph, and you get muscle motion readings. And subjects were supposed to flex whenever they want, and then after they flex, they were supposed to report where the spot was on the clock when they first became aware of their intention, decision, urge, different terms are used, to flex. So they flex, then they move the spot on the clock with a cursor to the point where they thought it was when they first became aware of this mental event. Now, when subjects were regularly reminded not to plan in advance when to flex, and then when after 40 flexings, that was a whole trial, they reported, yeah, I never had these thoughts in advance about what to do. The EEG started ramping up about 550 milliseconds before the muscle burst. That is roughly half a second before the muscle burst. And the average time of first reported awareness of the urge or whatever was 200 milliseconds before the muscle burst. So what Libet says is the brain unconsciously decides what to do about a third of a second before the mind or the person becomes aware of it. And he says free will is essentially conscious, so no free will is exhibited in the initiation of these actions. And then Libet generalized to all actions, all behavior. Now, there are lots of problems, actually, and maybe I'll just talk about one. So why should Libet think that what's going on at half a second before the muscle burst is that a decision is made as opposed to something else? Like there's a causal process up and running that may or may not generate a decision a bit later. And actually, he has no good reason to postulate a decision there, and there's some evidence that goes the other way. For example, you can do studies like this where people are watching other people who are about to do things, like there might be a green light and that signifies they're going to do something with their left hand. And you'll get similar readouts to these readouts. Also, the generalization idea is not well founded. So what's going on in this study is that you have various moments you could select for beginning to flex. And there's no reason to prefer any moment over any other. So it's rather like going to the supermarket and you have Planters Peanuts 16-ounce jar on your list, and you go to the display and you just reach out and take one, because it doesn't matter which one you take. You take one close to your eyes and arm. So it's not clear that actions like this have much to do with free will, since there's no reason to prefer other actions to them. And given that, it's hard to make or justify this generalization to all actions. There's much more to be said, but that's enough for now.
We'll get back to it for Woody. Okay, so my next question is also somewhat related to some of the things you were talking about, and that's for Hakwan. One of your papers is about theoretical motivations for investigating the neural correlates of consciousness. And one of the things you say there is that reflection, you propose some reflections on why brain imaging studies may actually not be totally useless, which is an interesting way to phrase it, because I bet some of your colleagues would say that of course they're useful. So what's your take on brain imaging studies then, from that perspective?
Right, so brain imaging studies are good. That's the short answer. they do certain things. So brain imaging studies is actually my major workhorse. Is what I do for a living. It pays my bills. And so we put people in a scanner, and then we use a technique called magnetic resonance imaging. That is a standard technique that doctors use to scan the brains to detect the tumors. But we have a modality called functional magnetic resonance imaging that allows us to track roughly the blood oxygenation in different regions of the brain. So from that, if you put people into the scanner and they do different stuff, and then you can track where the brain blood oxygenation levels seems to be changing, then you can track doing this task seems to involve using a certain part of the brain. And you can see that it's certainly a very important thing. It depends on what you want to do. If you want to figure out what doing certain things involve which part of the brain, for instance, like language, you want to know, well, what the language is really localized in some regions in the left side of the hemisphere, etc. There might be some very important clinical consequence if you know about these stuff. So if next time someone has a tumor near those regions, you would know, well, maybe we shouldn't, when we operate on this patient, we should be really careful because we know that the language areas are very nearby. If you cut out the tumor, you don't want to damage the language mechanisms because someone losing the language mechanism would be a potentially very, very bad thing. They might not even want to operate on the tumor and in order to keep the language mechanism. So there are things that are very good for brain imaging. But brain imaging also has a downside, I think many people outside of the business or even within the business do feel there's a problem is that because it creates those pretty pictures and you can see in magazines. There's a brain, a certain parts of the, when something light up, usually in pretty nice color like yellow and red and glowy orange, and you think that, oh, this is what you do when you think about your romantic partner, and then this part of the brain lights up, oh, this is love, this is wonderful. And there are studies of this sort actually being published in pretty high profile journals. So, and because this is my day job to do this kind of work, of course, I receive a lot of criticism of this sort that what we're doing is maybe useful for mapping where things are in the brain, but they may not be very useful theoretically. What does it tell you? I mean, if you know that romantic love lights up this part of the brain instead of the other part, does it tell you anything about love that is really worth knowing? And likewise, for what I do, a lot of my work studies the nature of sensory consciousness or awareness. So when you see something on top of the information processing, there seems to be a subjective phenomenal feel about this. So red looks a certain way and blue looks a different way. It's not just information, there's a subjective experience. So I tried to map out those things in the brain, and in that review paper I tried to say, under certain assumptions, and if you do it carefully, some of those images can be used to arbitrate between different theories about consciousness. And I would say probably the same likewise for free will too. Though I haven't written the paper for that problem. It requires some thinking, essentially. The bottom line is you can do those experiments, but you should also be thinking about those theories and what those theories would predict about brain images. Then you do those experiments to test those hypotheses, which is basically like Science 101. I mean, it's what we teach undergraduates, how science should be done, but sometimes in the field it is a little bit lacking in some areas.
Okay, thank you. Jesse, you also wrote a paper, now it's a number of years ago, on consciousness, the functional theory of consciousness, in which you suggested that there are actually 5 problems besides the so-called hard problem of consciousness related to what people are trying to understand. I'm going to go very briefly through it, and then there is a question that has to deal with free will. And here, you say that the 5 problems are the what problem, the problem of figuring out what we are conscious of, which is related to the where problem, where in the brain does consciousness arise, mechanism processes that can be pinpointed by pursuing a closely related problem, which is the when problem. Under what conditions do the states that are potentially conscious become conscious? Then you move on to the why problem. Why do we have consciousness to begin with? And then finally the who problem, meaning who is conscious other than presumably humans, non-human animals, or at least some humans, human infants, machines, and so on and so forth. Now, what struck me when I was reading that paper is that you can ask exactly the same questions about free will. And what I want to ask to you is that because there is quite a bit of overlap between the 2 problems? Are they just formally analogous, or is one a subset of the other, or what?
Oh, that's interesting. Am I mic'd too? Oh, it'll get sorted. I think there's a strong link conceptually between free will and consciousness in our ordinary thinking about will. And that's just this. When we act, we know that there are all kinds of determinants of behavior that we're not aware of. And those tend to be the ones we don't consider free. And it might not be a sufficient condition, but it does seem in our ordinary understanding to be a necessary condition of freedom, that we're conscious of what we're doing. There's controversy about this, but at least at some point in time, if we weren't conscious of the intention to act, the action that was performed doesn't strike us as free. If my arm moves in a twitch, I don't consider that an action over which I have volition, over which I have responsibility. And that raises the question about the relationship between consciousness and action. And there are people, Libet, who was mentioned by Al at the end, who have made the case that consciousness does occur before we act, but isn't actually the initial cause of our action. And some people have pushed that further, and they've said consciousness isn't a cause at all. Consciousness reports what our brain has decided to do unconsciously, but isn't actually part of the causal chain that leads up to action. It's as if the unconscious brain has said, move your arm, and it's had two effects totally independent of each other, the movement and then this conscious feeling of control. So one might get worried about this and start to say, well, it's bad enough to realize a lot of the things I do have no connection to consciousness whatsoever. A lot of our behaviors are driven by forces that we're not in any way aware of. But if it turns out that even the ones we are aware of are not caused by those states of awareness, that would be a very radical and disturbing discovery. And in thinking about consciousness, one of the questions I've been interested in since writing that paper, I have a book coming out on consciousness in a few months called The Conscious Brain. And the question of function, the question of why, which was one of the ones on the list, brings us directly into a question about how consciousness contributes to action. And contrary to some of the more alarmist reports from neuroscience suggesting that consciousness is divorced from action that Al mentioned, I do think there's a very, very compelling body of evidence that suggests that consciousness is intimately linked to action. And here's one way to think about it. In simple organisms, you don't need consciousness because actions are determined by the inputs, stimulus response. There's basically only one response given a stimulus for an insect. If you're a fly and you feel a hand moving towards you, or your body registers the wind currents changing that are associated with a hand moving towards you, it will cause you to launch from your resting place and take flight in an opposite direction. There's no further decision a fly can make. For more complicated creatures, mammals in particular, and especially human beings, the choice space is almost endless. And you can think about consciousness as a kind of pause button. The stimulus comes in, and instead of having to settle on a single response, there are a range of possible responses. And it's in that conscious moment where we are able to engage in some process of response selection. Interestingly, the actions for which we are least conscious are the ones that are most familiar, most rehearsed, the ones we've done most frequently. So if you're an experienced musician, say, the move from seeing a word, a musical bit of notation on your libretto to the movement of your hands on the instrument might not require conscious mediation. You've done it zillions of times before. But if you're just learning an instrument, you're going to need to think about what to do with that notation, and that act of deliberation will have some impact on your conscious state. So I think consciousness is fundamentally the place where decision-making is taking place in a way that can lead to flexibility.
Okay. Well, now, from part of what you guys have said so far, and from my own dealing with the relationship between neuroscience and not just free will, but as Michael pointed out earlier, for instance, there have been forays by neuroscientists into all sorts of topics that are of classical philosophical interest, such as morality. One of the things that strikes me is, and that although I do think, in fact, that neurobiology has quite a bit to say about all of these topics, is that too often what happens is that some people, at least, seem to think that finding the neural correlate for X is essentially the same as explaining X. So that when somebody says, well, it's the prefrontal cortex that is involved in your moral decision making in certain circumstances, your amygdala in other circumstances, therefore, there you go. You're done with the moral decision making, you don't need to know anything else. My mere reaction there is, well, duh, what do you think was going to happen? Obviously, there has to be some kind of neural correlate to pretty much everything we do, because that's the way we function as human beings. Now, granted that is an important piece of information to add to the puzzle, what else do we need in order to, quote unquote, explain things like morality, free will, consciousness, and so on? So what do we mean by an explanation here? And I guess I'm asking all four of you, so whoever wants to jump in. How many layers of explanations, how do they relate to each other? I know this is the kind of question that could keep us busy for the rest of the afternoon, but do your best. Sure.
So I think it's a great question, and one of the things that you want for an explanation is, if you're a neuroscientist especially, you're looking for some kind of mechanistic explanation. You want to know what are the you can think of it in terms of computations, that these groups of neurons are carrying out in different parts of your brain that allow you to do various behaviors. So you can think of the brain as some kind of high complexity computer that isn't quite built the way regular computers are. And so that's a mechanistic explanation, but often there's another kind of explanation that really matters for things like moral decision making, maybe free will, and that's an explanation at the level of reasons, which is what philosophers are most interested in, or largely interested in. So you want to know why did Jim decide to kill his cousin for the inheritance money or something, and you might then give a story in terms of reasons that makes understandable the action that he did. And I think that what's really exciting right now, the reason that a lot of philosophers and neuroscientists are talking to each other and are interested in each other's work, is because it looks like we might be in a position to start understanding how a reasons kind of explanation matches up with a mechanistic explanation, and then we would have this multi-level explanation for whatever that kind of behavior or phenomenon was.
Anybody else? Yeah.
Oh, I can add something. In some of the scientific work, in fact, much of it, where it's argued that experiments are showing that there's no free will tends to be conceived of in a way that requires non-material souls or non-material minds. And then what they think they're doing is showing that behavior has a basis in the brain, and so you don't need to postulate non-material souls or non-material minds to explain behavior. Now, some people do think about free will that way. Most philosophers don't. And then one way to try to make some progress here is to figure out how ordinary people think about free will, lay people, and then see whether they're closer to the philosophers or closer to the neuroscientists. And I've actually done some really simple studies where I present undergraduates who aren't taking philosophy courses with stories, and then I ask, did this guy do this thing freely? And one of the stories is set up like this. It's 10 years in the future, and scientists have finally discovered in this story that everything is physical, there isn't anything non-physical, and that decisions are actually brain states, and they're caused by other physical brain states. And then there's this guy named John who sees a $20 bill fall out of the pocket of the person in front of him, and he thinks about keeping it, but he decides to return it. And now they're supposed to pretend, that everything is physical. Scientists have discovered this. And I ask, did he freely keep it? And about 80% of people say yes. I've done lots of studies like this. I tweak them in different ways. But this is, pretty good evidence that as layfolk think about free will, it doesn't require non-material souls or non-material minds. And if one of the assumptions behind the view that it's been shown that there's no free will is that free will requires this sort of magical thing, then that assumption is challenged. Now, I think that a lot of people just use the expression free will, but they haven't really thought very deeply about what's involved in it. Here's a kind of analogy. So I teach philosophy of religion occasionally, and the last part of the course is on life after death. And so naturally, when you get to that topic, the idea of a soul comes up. And then I ask students, so what is a soul anyway? And they're kind of confused. They're trying to sort it out. And I say, well, here's a thought experiment that can maybe get you at it. So imagine that you die, and you go to the pearly gates, and God comes out, and he says, you're a pretty mediocre guy. You've done some good things. You've done some bad things. I'm going to give you a choice. You can send your soul to heaven and your mind to hell, or do it the other way around. Mind to heaven and soul to hell. And I ask students, so which would you choose, if you're the mediocre guy? And they think, I guess I'd send my soul to heaven because that's really me. And then some think, no, I'm going to send my mind to heaven because it holds all my memories. It's going to know what's going on. And they're just confused And even though they use the word soul and mind, relatively frequently. And I think that goes on with free will too. And that if we ask, controlled questions and try to get at people's concepts, we might discover something interesting. I think that's another dimension to this debate that needs to be pursued.
And I think somewhat related to the last question you asked me about what can science do about this kind of explaining, just finding a correlate, how does it explain free will? I myself find explaining things a pretty heavy business. What does it actually involve? And it's not very clear. There are many ways you can explain things. You can explain different levels. But I think scientists, like I said, very easily, we can distinguish different stories of how things actually work. So take one story that Jesse just talked about, like consciousness actually is part of the mechanism by which you make your decisions. And there's an alternative story, which is that actually consciousness is just what we call philosophical epiphenomenal. It just hang there and give you a sensation, but it's never part of the causal chain. So there are two different stories here. And when you have two different stories like this, then scientists like myself can try to do experiments to distinguish them. So then I think it involves finding the correlate, but the goal is no longer just finding a mere correlate of how things work. You're actually distinguishing between different stories. So in my lab, actually, we have some evidence that somewhat goes not against Jesse's story, but support the alternative story to some extent. That is, when you present visual information completely unconsciously, people don't even see the visual information. It was presented very briefly, and people cannot tell what it is. And that information can actually bias your subsequent choices in certain complex decisions, not just flexing your wrist, like deciding which task to do next, etc., checking your email, calling your parents, something like a complex decision. And that also, that activity, that subliminal or unconscious visual information can actually activate the very higher cognitive areas in the brain that is supposedly specialized or particularly developed in humans, like the prefrontal cortex, some areas that are basically much less developed in children and smaller animals. And so that somewhat suggests that maybe the unconscious information can go all the way and drive all those decisions. And that would raise the question, maybe consciousness is really just going along for the ride, is not doing much. Of course, it's a single study. I'm not trying to claim that shows you anything decisive, but you can see that this is the kind of work that a scientist can do to try to distinguish between stories that are very important to us, which one is correct. If Jesse's view is correct, that seems to me that free will has some meaningful place in our discussion. Whereas if consciousness is really totally going along for the ride, it doesn't do anything. You just feel that you just have the conscious illusion that you're in control, but actually all the actions are decided already unconsciously. It just happens that your conscious decision just somehow synchronized to the unconscious story, but it was never part of the causal chain. If that is true, that seems to me a little bit frightening. Mm-hmm. So I think there's something scientists can do about this.
Justin, do you want to?
Well, briefly on that, I think the view that unconscious states don't contribute to choice would be indefensible. In fact, going back to our fly on the wall, its unconscious perception of the moving hand led to an action. And there might even be some sense in which that action it can be thought of as a choice. There might be multiple factors that drive the direction that the fly takes off. If there's an obstacle in front of the fly that its visual system is telling it about, then it has information about the moving hand as well as information about a barrier, and those need to somehow be resolved in order to determine what to do. So I think I overstated the case in saying choice doesn't exist without consciousness, but what we'd expect to look for is a kind of qualitative difference where when you have conscious access to information, it increases the flexibility of your response. So instead of it just being a case where there's a kind of algorithm where there are several constraints and then there's an optimal solution to dealing with those multiple constraints, we can flexibly, through strategic decision-making, bring new sources of information to bear. We can choose to learn new things. We can try to call up memories that might be relevant to solving the problem. So when we're asked a question here on the stand, we hear these words, and these words are unconsciously activating our memories, but then we're consciously reflecting on what's said. And that capacity allows us to access our memories in a way that isn't just this brute causal process, like a ball going through a pinball machine, hitting everything that it coincides with, but might be directed by a whole bunch of other factors that would not be accessible to us in this very bottom-up way. I myself think that those sophisticated forms of decision-making are not taking place in consciousness itself, but the presence of a conscious input increases and maybe qualitatively changes the range of possible sources of information we can bring to bear in solving a problem. So you can think about consciousness as a kind of menu for action. So when you see a menu and you see 3 different kinds of dessert on the menu and you can pick between them, the availability of that information to consciousness has a big impact on how that choice is made. And the simplest way to show this is just to point out that absent consciousness, human behavior becomes radically uninteresting. So if you consider people who are comatose, for instance, different kinds of coma cases involve different degradations of consciousness, but certainly in cases where there are profound insults to consciousness, it does look like behavior becomes very, very simple.
So I'm reminded of a cartoon that came out a few years ago by a Dilbert cartoon, where the two of the characters were discussing free will. And one of them would say, well, it's my free will decision to do X. And the other guy says, so where does that decision come from? And they get into these really interesting discussion over 3 panels. And the more the cartoon, actually 4 panels, the more the cartoon proceeds, the more you see that the character who was talking about free will starts waving his hands more and more frantically until it's clear that he doesn't know what he's talking about. Which reminds me of one of the best books that I've read on the issue of free will, which was by Dan Dennett, who was talking about, he actually wrote 2 about it, but I'm referring to Elbarum, the earlier one. And he was talking about, he was trying to make distinctions between free will as is understood by certain people or other people, and the kinds of free will that is worth having. The kind of free will that is actually a reasonable definition of free will that is worth talking about and discussing about both philosophically and scientifically. So as you noticed, I didn't start this panel by asking each one of you, what do you mean by free will? Well, now it's the point. We got to that point. What is it that we're trying to explain exactly?
Okay, you're looking at me. I'll start. Okay. Well, a couple of years ago, I did a panel thing at the World Science Festival with Patrick Haggard and Dan Wegner. And this is how that one started. They asked us what we thought about free will, what we thought it was. And I gave 3 answers, and I'll give you 3. And Patrick gave
Is it the
one.
same 3?
Yeah, it's the same
Okay.
3. And Dan gave 1. And my girlfriend was in the audience, and at the end, she said, people were complaining because nobody told them what free will is. And I'm thinking, well, they got 5 answers. That's pretty good. So, okay. Out there in free will land, I think there are roughly 3 different conceptions of free will. And I think of it on a gas station model. So you can get regular, you can get mid-grade, you can get premium. And sufficient for regular free will would be something like this. The person who's making a decision is sane and rational, he's well-informed or she's well-informed, and decides on the basis of reasons in the absence of any sort of manipulation or intense pressure from the outside or the inside. That's one way to understand free will. It's a very down-to-earth kind of thing. It's regular. Now, there are people who worry that if this process is what philosophers call deterministic, and Adina explained determinism at the beginning, it's just a matter of the laws of nature plus the state of the universe at any time actually logically entailing everything that will ever happen. So that things are sort of fixed, as it were. It's not as though anybody's causing things to happen this way. It's just the way it is. And some people think, well, you need something you can't get in that kind of scenario to have free will. And so what you need really is that some of the laws of nature be probabilistic as opposed to exceptionless. And then there's a little bit of wiggle room in the fabric of the universe. And actually, you're going to need it in the brain, too. So that at the moment when people make some decisions, they could have done something else instead. And that's sort of mid-grade free will. It's a lot like the first kind, except you build this indeterminism, this absence of exceptionless laws into the story. And then the third kind, the premium, is the kind that requires maybe immaterial souls or minds. Now, in my own work on free will, I try to argue that we should just set that third one aside, concentrate on numbers 1 and 2, and then I try to present sort of attractive pictures of these two kinds of free will. So I would say free will is either the regular kind or the mid-grade kind that I described.
Okay.
I think for scientists, again, I may be repeating this point, but trying to explain something is actually fairly hard. I mean, of course, we do explain things, but to set it as a goal is a vague goal that you can give yourself a lot of leeway to try to say what counts as sufficient, satisfactory explanation. But I think on Jesse's picture that he just said, again, the consciousness being enhancing your choices, I think if that story is true, I would say there probably is free will. But what I'm worried is that story may not be a done deal. So the alternative, more frightening, where consciousness is not doing anything, it's just going along for the ride, that story is not completely ruled out. So as a scientist, I feel that on that story, I would say probably that there isn't real free will as we understand it.
But when you say as we understand it, from your particular perspective, what do you mean? What are you looking for there?
Yeah, so
in
I'm giving you, instead of defining it, I'm trying to sidestep the problem in some way. Say So on Jesse's picture,
that's what a good scientist would do, exactly. Yes.
On Jesse's picture, there is free will, probably. I think that's pretty. I think it's not so controversial. Mm-hmm. And on the other story, I think the normal notion the notion of free will worth thinking about is quite threatened by that. So that the difference between them, you can say, probably contains some elements of truth about the nature of free will.
Fair enough.
Okay, so often when I think about free will, I think about why we should care about it. And the thing that usually strikes me as the most important thing that we think of as linked to free will is moral responsibility. So we think, well, I can't hold somebody responsible for what they do if they couldn't have helped it, if they couldn't have done otherwise.
My brain made me do it.
My brain made me do it. So what I think we care about with free will is whatever that is. And again, there are different views that you might have on what that kind of thing might require. I think that for me, one of the things that at least has emerged in my own thinking about as being important to that kind of free will is having one's actions, in a sense, dependent on your own autonomous decision. Okay, but then what does it mean to have an autonomous decision? What does it mean for a decision to stem from yourself? I personally think that it's completely possible to have decisions stem from who you are, even if those decisions are, in some sense, determined, entailed by the laws of the universe. I think of myself as some physical system, and it's a physical system that does a lot of things, including making decisions. And so I don't see a huge problem with reconciling that notion of autonomy with a completely deterministic picture. So I tend to be a compatibilist.
Compatibilist, yes.
So, yeah, I guess I don't like the topic of free will for the following reason. As a philosophy student,
we'll get you a glass.
We should all leave, everyone go home, we're wasting your time. As a philosophy student, you come to your classes and you're very eager to learn about free will, and you think it's this kind of metaphysical question, or maybe a scientific question. Is it the case that the universe is such that actions originate from me, or am I just part of the causal order where everything I do has been somehow predetermined by the configuration of particles at the Big Bang and the laws of physics? Well, aside from the kind of little nuanced issue of quantum theory making physical laws deterministic, and probabilistic instead of deterministic, the answer to that metaphysical question has pretty much been answered. We pretty much know that what we do is in some sense just determined by the configuration of particles at the beginning of the universe, plus the laws of physics. So the metaphysical question or the scientific question of free will was resolved, with the advent of modern science. It's done. We can all go home. It's depressing, but there you have it. But then philosophers who are very good at wishful thinking, which is something Al has worked a lot on. I don't use views of wishful thinking. say, well, this is such an unpleasant view, we need to find some way to preserve freedom. And then what they do is they resort to ordinary language. And they say, we have all these uses of the word free. So for instance, if I call you up and say, are you free for dinner on Wednesday? You might say, yes. You're free, therefore you're free. If you tried to get up Broadway this evening and you got stopped by the police, you weren't free to walk on certain streets. So we have these uses of free that are perfectly colloquial. And we can say, okay, there's some notion of freedom that's actually perfectly applicable in the world. Some actions are done under duress, other actions are not done under duress. And I think in that sense, yeah, it's true, we are free in some way, but in these kind of boring ways. And then as a philosophy student, I went home frustrated thinking the only freedom philosophers have been able to prove exists is not this metaphysical kind of freedom. My actions still aren't coming from me. But I think actually some of these ordinary notions of freedom turn out to be quite worth investigating. So Massimo mentioned Dan Dennett's phrase, what kind of free will is worth having? And I think when we look at the various things we're calling free, we can still ask further questions about whether the way those actions came about is consistent with our current practices of blaming and praising people for their behavior, holding people responsible, punishing them, rewarding them. And even though, as Hakwan has pointed out, I was very inclined to suggest that consciousness may play a role in the causal determination of action, and in that sense we're free. There are other senses in which we're radically unfree, far less free than we think we are. So if we want to just drop the phrase free will and ask the following question, I think we'd be better off. And the question is, are the determinants of human behavior such that they should force a revision of how we think we act and how we credit and blame people? And from that perspective, I think the prospect of identifying a kind of freedom in human behavior becomes a lot more grim, which is to say, so much of what we do is determined by the factors that we don't think should make a difference. So if I were to guess who the people in this room voted for, I would say you overwhelmingly voted Democratic. And I'm sure there are some outliers. But I could guess that because we're in New York City. The idea that there's an election map that can plot as a function of geography where the liberals are should freak us out. It should freak us out because it suggests that decision-making is not based on argument, on information. It's based on demography. If you just take a demographic survey and tell me your income, your gender, your race, whether you're urban or rural, whether you're religious or not, I can guess who you're going to vote for pretty darn well. And you guys walk around thinking you have reasons for your votes. You walk around thinking you voted for this candidate because it's the best candidate, given the information you have. You think the people on the other side are just confused, or maybe they're evil. The conservatives are clearly just stupid. We use that kind of rhetoric. But they're just growing up in a different town. And I think once we discover that a huge swath of human behavior is determined in that kind of way, even if there's a sense in which consciousness is contributing to action, there's a deeper sense in which the sources of human agency are external to us in a way that matters, that should force us to revise our voting practices and maybe revise our practices of rewarding people, but also, maybe even more importantly, punishing people. And that's the question that I think we should advance in place of the question, do we have free will, whatever that means?
But Jesse, as I think Stephen Colbert said, reality does have a liberal bias, so it's not quite as simple as you put it. Anyway, now you mentioned
liberals control the academy.
Yeah, exactly. So you mentioned, of course, the Q word, quantum mechanics, and as many people probably here know, Richard Feynman, who was one of the few people who actually understood quantum mechanics, famously said that if you think you understand quantum mechanics, you probably don't. And yet, quantum mechanics does come out every time that we talk about free will, and interestingly, I think it comes out in two very different ways. One is the one that you mentioned a minute ago, which is the one related to determinism. Well, it's quarks all the way down, so it's got to be determined. This is a deterministic universe, so what are you talking about, free will? The other one is, oh yes, there is free will, and it's because of quantum fluctuations, because as you pointed out, actually quantum mechanical events tend to be stochastic, not deterministic. Can we please get rid of the quantum mechanics stuff in this free will? I mean, what do you guys think about, what does quantum mechanics have to say, if anything, about free will? Briefly.
Oh, okay. I can say something brief about it. I was at a conference on this in Barcelona about a year ago, and we had some high-powered physicists on the side of quantum mechanical events in the brain. But in any case, there are some neurobiologists who claim they've found good evidence of indeterministic processes in behavior-producing streams in fruit flies. Now, you might think, well, that can't have anything to do with free will. It's fruit flies, after all. There was an article that came out in the press saying that fruit flies have free will, but that's a misinterpretation. But if it's there, so suppose there is the absence of determinism in the brain. That is, suppose that laws that govern brain operations are probabilistic. They're not exceptionless. And then evolution could work with that aspect of brains, if it's there, and build up indeterministic decision-producing processes in us. And that's what these biologists are actually after. So if you find something like this in flies, and I'm not claiming that they have, although they claim they have, you could imagine that it's part of our evolutionary heritage, and that there is some indeterminism, some probabilism in our decision-producing streams. And that would give you the kind of flexibility, or would help give you, the kind of flexibility that the mid-grade free people value. And so I think that the door on this is not closed. It's open. There are even hypotheses about how it works. Probability clouds passing through ion channels. Who the heck knows? You can't really measure it now. But there are models of it. And I think it's an option. But I myself also think that if things don't turn out that way, we have what Adina called compatibilism to fall back on, and it's a perfectly beautiful view about free will. It's that regular conception of free will.
Yeah, go ahead, Adina.
Well, I just wanted to sort of highlight what I think the problem is with relying on quantum mechanics or any kind of indeterminism to undergird your free will, because what you have with these indeterministic processes are things that depend on nothing and not you, for sure, right? And if, let's say, you're going to say that what makes the difference between you pulling the trigger and killing the guy or putting the gun back in your pocket is some quantum fluctuation, why should you be blamed for shooting the guy if it's a quantum fluctuation that makes the difference, right? So if what we're looking for is something to undergird moral responsibility.
My quarks made me do it.
My quarks made me do it. Why is that a solution to that problem? It seems crazy. So I am completely neutral on whether or not there are quantum effects that have some kind of high-level consequences in the brain and in behavior. I think it's up to the physicists to tell us what the right interpretation of quantum mechanics is, but I don't see that it saves you anything. It doesn't make the problem go away for explaining how it is that we're responsible for our actions. So why not just be a compatibilist and say, I'm a compatibilist, I don't care whether determinism is true or not. Here's my story for how we're morally responsible for our actions.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, a kind of metaphor might help. If you imagine that scientists open the brain and start studying neurons, and they discovered, astonishingly, that deep inside neurons, there are these things that are just like dice. It's like dice, So what happens is when before a neuron fires, the little neural die rolls, and it gets a 1 or a 2 or a 3, and whatever the outcome of that die roll is going to determine whether the neuron fires or not. So we've discovered neural dice. It seems to me that if we discovered neural dice, we wouldn't in any way think we were more free. And it's an old point that David Hume made. Random behavior is not free behavior. In fact, freedom seems to involve the opposite of randomness, as Adina suggested, it involves control. So I think if we think that the key transformation in physics that was ushered in by the more popular interpretations of quantum theory was a kind of indeterminacy, a kind of probability at base physics, then even if that scales up to brains and behavior, it's nothing more than dice in the brain.
I think I have two opposite things to say. I think on the whole, I agree with all of you. I think it's true that there's a kind of maybe not very well-founded historical viewpoint about this is when people talk about these in the 60s or so, quantum mechanics was exciting. So a lot of the philosophical literature probably goes way back before that, but even at that point, people still talk about this. But I think today, quantum mechanics is still pretty mysterious and it remains so, but we use it every day. We have a fairly good understanding of how it works. The interpretations are still quite complex. If you turn on the CD player, you use quantum mechanics, and we have a fairly good understanding that we know that it's probably quite irrelevant to the whole topic of free will. And I think the scientific input to the problem of free will kind of shifted into a problem of what is a function of consciousness. Is consciousness in the causal chain of information processing, etc. Well, I like this view a lot. I think I'm in good company here. I think most of us kind of agree this is partly true. And it put myself in, it kind of means that the limelight should shift away from the physicist and turn into the work done in my lab. And so I like that view. Having said that, though, I actually have a neighbor. A next door neighbor is a physicist, and sometimes having a conversation with them is really pretty mind-bending. He would say, well, today I go and do an experiment, I put one thing in two places at the same time. And he seems to be very fine about that. He's kind of smart. Yeah, you put one thing in two places at the same time. I do it all the time. It's tabletop physics. It's not even like very expensive. You can give me a few $100, I can buy you some machines that you can do it at home. And I think there is a lot of interpretational issues within physics. It's not very clear. I think we all take the standard interpretation of quantum mechanics, then it's just a wave function, it's kind of probabilistic. But there are different interpretations, some of which imply that for the probabilistic behavior of small things to be settled, you need conscious observation. So that actually brings consciousness back to the story. And I'm not an expert about this, and I actually have not talked to any experts about this that makes sense to me. But what I'm saying is maybe we shouldn't close the door too early either. I think that the trend is basically we think that quantum mechanics is basically too abstruse to be relevant to this topic, but there might be something there that we just don't know enough yet.
I have one more question for the panelists, and then we'll move to Q&A. So if people want to start lining up, probably about getting Michael's attention. Good luck, since it's pretty dark as far as I can tell. So the last question is this: so when I moved a few years ago from science to philosophy, one of the refreshing things that I learned was the philosophers have no qualms insulting each other on a regular basis in public. Scientists do the same, but it's all.
You've got to be a real jerk to say that.
Exactly. QED. Scientists do the same. They just do it backstabbing. So one of the things they do, they hurl at each other some interesting words, even at meetings. And one of the worst insults, of course, that can be hurled by a philosopher to another philosopher is to say that something that the first person said is incoherent. Because if there's one thing you don't want to be, it's incoherent as a philosopher. Probably as anybody, but particularly as a philosopher. Now, on the other hand, that is in fact the kind of term that gets thrown around quite a bit when we talk about free will. That perhaps the problem with the whole concept, a couple of you have certainly suggested we should abandon or rephrase the whole idea, or maybe have 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 different versions of it. Is it possible that part of the reason why you experienced so much frustration when you did the discussions on free will is because, in fact, it's the concept itself that it's essentially unsalvageable, that we really should get rid of it and move on to something else?
Al's experimental work on free will is part of a new approach to philosophy that involves using survey methods to try and understand how ordinary people understand these terms that philosophers have been interested in. And it's been hugely illuminating, but it's also been a little bit depressing. And one of the ways, I feel like I'm the voice of depression tonight. My meds must be in need of a higher dose. But I think that these survey results have revealed the following fact, which is that people's ideas about freedom are very, very flexible. That's a friendly way of saying they're really unstable, which is to say a small variant in a vignette. You give people a little scenario and say, was the action described in this scenario free? A small variant in how the action is described can alter people's intuitions about whether the person was free. And the variants often aren't ones that really should matter. So, and Adina has done a bunch of work of this kind too, which she can tell you about. And I think that suggests that the ordinary notions of freedom are incoherent is probably not too strong a word. We have many different notions of freedom. We apply them in ways that are fairly inconsistent. And unless we fix on one of those meanings, we can't ask the question, are we free? We need to ask, are we free in the following sense, and specify that quite exactly. So I think at the level of abstraction that this panel and other conferences on free will have been set up, we often end up feeling like we're not making much progress because it's not clear that we're talking about the same thing. And for that reason, again, I'll say, let's not use the word. For the rest of the evening, let's see if we can get by without mentioning free will at all.
Any other comment on that particular question, whether the concept itself is incoherent?
Oh, well, yeah, I'm not sure there's exactly one concept there. I think two, maybe three. But you find this in lots of areas. So, for example, intentional action. How many concepts of that are there among lay folk? I've actually tested this too. And it looks like 2 or 3. So I think you can proceed. If you like the expression free will, you just say, well, here's one interpretation of it, here's another, here's a third. Has science shown that there's no free will on any of those interpretations? Maybe on one, not the other 2. But another way to sort of make things more concrete is something Adina mentioned. People tend to think that if nobody had any free will, nobody would be morally responsible for anything. And so then what you could do is you talk about moral responsibility, and you think, well, maybe free will, whatever it is going to be a necessary condition for that. And then if you can get very clear on moral responsibility, you can come to a view of what free will is that way, just treating it as a necessary condition for moral responsibility. Now, it's probably going to turn out that the more philosophers and others study moral responsibility, the clearer it will become that there isn't just one concept there, but a couple, 2 or 3. I think that's okay. Philosophers usually want things to be just one way, and then they argue with other philosophers who think, well, things are just the other way. And I think maybe we can make more progress if we're sort of open-minded, and we'll talk about the different ways and see where the evidence goes on those different conceptions of it.
Any more about incoherence?
Yeah, I tend to think it is. I think, we're actually all being nice because we're not saying anybody's view is incoherent. We're just saying there's this concept that people have, which is incoherent. But I think it is because I think, most people think that if they're sure of anything, they're sure that they're free. And they also tend to think that if the world is determined, if everything's deterministic, they're not free. But then if they think about if the universe is indeterministic and their choices are made on the indeterministic basis, they're also not free. So it can't be that all 3 of those things are true. And if all 3 of those things seem appealing to you, then I think that that's an indication that there's some incoherence in the concept.
Okay. We can open the floor to...
I operate at a much lower level than most of the discussion here, but I saw Daniel Dennett's lecture at the University of Edinburgh, where my recollection is that his conclusion was we do not have free will in the way that it's been classically understood. What we have are capabilities for deciding on differences in our immediate sort of behaviors. And as he said, that's good enough for me. And that's my explicit, and I've watched this interview 3 or 4 times, and it's the one where he discusses the chess playing computer and the choices made by the chess playing computer, the apparent choices made that allow it to defeat a human chess champion, and analogizes our brains. What is your response to his analysis based on that comparison?
Okay, so the question, just so that everybody is on the same page, is, well, then it actually said explicitly several times that he does not believe that there is any such thing as free will, at least not in the ordinary sense of the discussion, but that we can, there are ways in which we can recover the idea of basically decision making. So any thought on that? I assume that most people here won't disagree with that take.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly think that's right. The traditional view that I think he wants to rule out is connected to the view that Al said was the extra, super unleaded.
Yeah, it could be the premium strength.
This is the kind of soul stuff view where we have some immaterial substance that controls our behavior and is not under control of the laws of physics. Once we realize that our decisions are physically based, we have to give up on that. But there might be still sense to phrases like, we live in a free country, and I was free to come here this evening. And some of my actions are done out of choice, meaning that my conscious choices played a role in arriving at those actions. Those notions of freedom might be the ones that we often care about, and they're certainly ones that I think everyone agrees here are scientifically plausible, though there's some controversy. On the other hand, and this is a half-full, half-empty issue, you might get comfortable, almost complacent with the idea that, yeah, I have enough free will. I have the kind of free will that's worth having, because after all, I make a lot of decisions that affect my behavior. But when we step back from that and start to look at the determinants of those decisions, I think our sense that we have free will worth having might start to decline. So this is me in my pessimist role again, but I do think that there's a sense in which even if we retain this notion that consciousness is a causal player in action, if our preferences are set up by the environments we live in, by the genes we happen to have inherited and so on, our sense of human autonomy and worth might still be seriously imperiled.
Yeah, sure.
I think all of us basically agree, at least here, the majority of us definitely agree that the classically defined notion of free will is not really worth talking about anymore. But I have some skepticism about the view that Dennett has taken, that it seems that we don't have the premium, but we have the good enough free will. And I think it's fair for Al and many other people to say this is probably true, and science has not proven that you don't have the most minimal notion of free will yet. But I would say it's basically not a done deal. I think quite a lot of empirical work is still up in the air, like how much consciousness has causal impact on your action. So the notion of then that we can make decisions and like inhibit certain desires to do bad things and stuff, assume that your conscious intention of doing this is actually doing the work. There's an alternative picture, which is that actually no, somehow unconsciously there is some process doing all that work. And it's not you. You consciously don't want to do bad things, but actually that has no impact on your on not doing bad things. Actually, you so far you haven't done any really bad things because somehow unconsciously you have some process doing that. But tomorrow you may lose that. If tomorrow you lose that, and even if you consciously still think you're a good person, you might end up doing those bad things. And if that is true, I mean, I'm not saying that this is a true story. I'm saying if you take the evidence as a scientist, I can tell you there is suggestive evidence for this picture. And so much, there's a lot of evidence that seems to suggest the other picture, the Jesse's picture, that consciousness is doing all these control functions and decision making is true too. But I'm just saying, so to the extent that this is not a done deal, there is still a danger that we might need to revise our whole idea of moral responsibility, punishment, freedom, etc. So let's not try to conclude it too fast.
But I have a very quick comment before we go to the second question on that one. So it's interesting when the way you just put it a minute ago is, if it's not consciousness, it's not you. Well, let's say that I turn around quickly and catch a ball that has been turned my way without realizing that that's what I'm doing. Would I be saying that it wasn't me catching the ball just because I wasn't conscious of that decision, right? So there are ways, I mean, my unconscious processing is still me. It is me in a different sense, obviously. On that one we agree, but it's still me.
I think, yeah, I'm being kind of sloppy and not very precise about what is you here. But I think a lot of the time when we say that you are doing this or you did not act like
we mean the conscious.
If it is actually unconscious is driving all the action. Right. Let's say someone has a very, very unfortunate brain disease such that the conscious and the unconscious become really dissociated. So conscious intention to try to inhibit any action would fail because of a certain brain deficiency. And then all the unconscious desires that he has no control over, that he doesn't even know about, can drive the person to do really bad things. You can say, well, it's still you that is bad, but in that case, do we still want to punish this person?
Right.
there's a view that, well, because it's still your brain, we should punish this brain, so we should punish you with punishing the unconscious you. But that's something funny about that, I think, that we should worry about.
Michael. Yeah.
All right. It seems like we have a working mic, so just remember brief and concise questions. Sir, you were the first to stand up, so why don't you go first?
I wanted to ask a slightly different question, and I'll refer to a word that Jesse used. Namely, he said if we found that we had no free will, then that would be disturbing. I wanted to ask why it would be disturbing, since if we made such a discovery, things would go on, things would be exactly the same now, right? So it's not like it would be bad news because it wouldn't be news. And nonetheless, there is a sense in which we do find it disturbing. And I would like to suggest maybe that instead of thinking of ourselves as being in a prison, not having free will, we should say there is no prison.
Nice. That's my colleague Rohit. I would say that there are various failures of freedom that we don't find disturbing. So there's something called the chameleon effect. So all of you are looking at a bunch of people on stage with your legs crossed. The probability that your legs are crossed goes up as a result. If we were all sitting like this, fewer of you would have crossed legs right now. Is that bothersome? Not especially. All of you have musical taste as a result of what you were exposed to growing up. I like jazz. I might not have liked jazz if I grew up in a different musical environment. So should I stop listening to jazz because I didn't choose jazz? No, I still love jazz, and that's all that matters to me. The problem is that we have some choices that are affected in ways that lead to consequences that I think we need to revise. So take two examples. One of them is punishment. We send people to prison, we deprive them of their liberty, their autonomy, and we make them suffer terribly, where in many cases we can actually identify social forces that might have played a major role in leading them to engage in this criminal behavior. So the method of shaping behavior through incarceration is not only not a terrifically effective one to alter behavior, but it might be unjust or unethical, given that it's a strong form of punishment, it's a strong form of cruelty for behaviors that might have originated in a person's social environment, rather their evil soul. Second example, and here my own New York liberalism will come out, taxation. We have a lot of people who make a lot of money. And some of the people who make a lot of money because they're particularly clever. But lots of people make a lot of money because they were born in the right circumstances. They were raised in the right city. They went to the right university. They got the right inheritance. There's a lot of luck, of birthright, that goes into having the fortunes that some of us have. And if your success in the world is partially a function of that privileged position, which you had nothing to do with, then the notion of redistribution, of distributive justice that involves putting people who are in this particular position of privilege in a tax bracket that makes them give away some of that to people who might not have been born in such a position of privilege seems to look more justified than it would look if we didn't have a correct picture of the determinants of action. So in a certain metaphysical sense, we can't help it. We're gonna, if determinism is true, we're gonna do what we do. But I think just having conversations about these kinds of sources of behavioral control might help usher us towards policy changes that could have a huge impact on how we conduct our lives.
Yeah, I have a small point to add. There actually is evidence that lowering people's subjective confidence that they have free will increases misbehavior. There was a nice study done by Kathleen Voss and Jonathan Schooler, and well, I'll simplify it. Half the subjects read passages saying that there's no free will, scientists saying that there's no free will.
Francis Crick.
Yeah, and half read neutral passages. And then the next task was to take a little math quiz. And all the subjects were told, the program's a little glitchy, and if you don't press the space bar right away, then the answer's going to show up, and you can cheat. And so the group that read the no free will passages cheated a lot more often than the control group. In a version of this study, they were also paid $1 for every correct answer. So in effect, people who got the no free will news were stealing more often than the others. My colleague Roy Baumeister at FSU did a study like this where the well, first of all, half the people read just sentences denying free will, 25 sentences, not authoritative ones, and half read neutral sentences. And then the next task was to serve snacks to people who were about to come into the room, and they were told two things about these people. They've all indicated that they really hate spicy food, and they have to eat everything you put on their plate. And the people who read the no free will passages put way more spicy salsa on their plates than the other people. So it's not as though this news should be expected to have no effect on people. A certain significant percentage of people might think, oh, geez, I have no free will. Let me go for it. You know, let me act on lots of those nasty urges.
One of the things we're learning tonight is that both philosophers and cognitive scientists have a Machiavellian way of doing experiments.
Would that philosophy still classify into free will?
Oh, okay, sure. So conceived billions of years ago in the sense of caused, or the causes were present back then? Is that the idea?
No, like, I know my dad is going to have a cup of coffee before 10 o'clock tomorrow morning, but he determines that.
Foreseeable, maybe.
Yeah, I see.
Foreseeable, yeah, more than conceived, I guess, would be the word. Foreseeable as opposed
foreseeable.
to, right.
Okay.
Right. Because conceived might imply that there was some intelligent designer who actually sat down and planned the whole thing.
Yeah. Yeah, you know, on that what's called compatibilist, we can just call it regular conception of free will. Foreseeable decisions can be free, and actually decisions that are predictable with absolute certainty can be free. All that really matters is the person is sane and rational, nobody's pushing them around, and well-informed. So on that conception of free will, yeah, the answer is yes. On the mid-grade one, where there's some probabilism in the laws of nature, things could be predictable, not with absolute certainty, but with something approximating that, and still be free. So on that one, yes, the answer would be yes. On the third one, yes. Yes again.
All right, then. It's like a slot machine. Yes, yes, yes.
That's right. It's a winner.
Anyone else in the panel have a thought about that, or?
Okay, next question.
We'll move on to the next question. Let's get some hands high.
There's
You got
some.
your hands up here.
Yeah, you might want to move down the next few rows next.
Any progress on evolutionary pathways to our sense of free will?
I'm the evolution biologist here, but I'll let you guys go first. Yes.
This is, well, sort of a related answer. One thing that you said is our sense of free will. There are actually pretty, at least given what neuroscience understands at this point, there are some well-understood pathways about that govern why we feel like we act freely when we act. And these are just basic feedback systems so that when our parts of our brain issue instructions to our motor cortex that then ends up moving our muscles, they also sort of send an image forward so that you realize that it was you that generated that, and you can manipulate that feeling by, for instance, stimulating motor cortex without having that image at the same time, and you feel like the action was alien to you. So you can play around with that system and get people to feel like they acted or didn't act freely, even though you're doing all the manipulating. And those are sort of basic parts of the motor system that are shared with lots of other animals. So in that sense, our sense of free will, I don't know that if you mean more the concept, I wonder whether other animals have any kind of concept that relates to our concept of freedom.
Right. I mean, I think that for one thing, whenever we start asking evolutionary questions, we have to separate the question of did X, in this case free will or a sense of free will, evolve versus was it the result of natural selection. Often people actually mean the latter. You know, is there a function, biological function that is being carried out? So the answer to the first question is yes. Everything we do evolved in the broad sense of the word evolution because we are the process of a result of an evolutionary process. That doesn't mean that everything we do did evolve, even if it does have neural correlates that build on something else. Evolved for adaptive reasons. So if that is the question, I mean, the answer there is that it's very easy to make up stories for why that might be the case, but it's incredibly difficult to actually test those stories. Just think about the fact that we don't even have a particularly good idea of why we're conscious at all from an evolutionary perspective, not how we're conscious from a neurobiological perspective, although even that one is far from being settled. But evolutionarily, why bother? But even further than that, we actually don't have a particularly convincing answer to the question of why the hell do we have big brains to begin with, right? Because given that most other animals, including social animals, seem to be able to get away pretty nicely with much smaller brains, which are much less metabolically costly and so on and so forth. There are a bunch of theories out there, but testing those theories and actually coming down to the most likely answer is far from an easy task.
All right, we have a question
Yeah,
up here.
Michael.
The concept that keeps going through my mind through all of this, bottom line, is Freud's repetition compulsion, where people are absolutely compulsive about repeating negative things that happened in their life with other people later on in their life. And even though they know this might be bad for them and they know that they shouldn't be doing this, they can't stop it. And so to me, if that's not determinism, it seems to me and it affects people who they choose as their mates, how they treat their children, all of everything that's gone on in, abusive relationships, rape relationships, abusive towards their children. All of that seems to me, and that's the work of the psychotherapist, to kind of loosen that up and get them to see.
Okay, so the question would be, anybody wants to comment on the F word?
Sure.
Yeah.
I mean, because it in a way ties into the last question, which is about evolution, because evolution question says, are we kind of getting more free as we evolve? And I think there are lots of ways in which human behavior is not particularly free. So for instance, in learning, human beings are much better imitators than any other animal, including great apes. But to imitate, you really need to sort of slavishly copy what's been presented to you, and that's in some way giving up on freedom. One way to think about this, I mean, Freud came up with the repetition of compulsion because he was dissatisfied with a model of the mind that was basically hedonistic. So it comes up in his book Beyond the Pleasure Principle, and he says, look, we're not motivated by pleasure. We often do things that are really unpleasurable. And this was fairly late in his career, so he had written a lot about sublimated desire and all of that, but he said, no, really on reflection, pursuit of desire is not the sole determinant of behavior. We're often doing things that are abjectly miserable. And is that because there's a repetition compulsion? I think to reify that concept and say that somehow by nature what we want to do is repeat is somewhat mystifying. Why? There's a simpler explanation, and it's called laziness. So we've all had the following experience. You're sitting watching television, and there's a terrible program on, or maybe just a TV commercial. And you don't want to watch it, it's unpleasant, it's aversive. And the remote control is just like where that bottle of water is in relation to my hand. So it's 2 feet away. But this little reaching action, I notice I haven't had a sip of water throughout this conversation. I'm parched. But this little action takes energy. And we try to avoid expenditure of energy. Behaving in ways that save that for the next panel on altruism. So in repeating patterns, what we very often do is we fall into a template, a kind of a way of engaging that we've already mastered, we've already done this, so it's familiar to us, it's easy to do. It's not pleasant, but it's what we know, and it would take real work, like years of psychotherapy, to shift out of the pattern. So we'd rather be unpleasant and lazy. Unpleasant, we would rather be miserable but not expend energy than happy and have to work at it.
And as a corollary, we just established that I'm far less lazy than Jesse because I got up twice to pick up my water. We have time for one more question.
Yeah, we'll do one more, and we'll try to keep it concise and brief. Really torn now, but I'm going to go with the fellow in the sweater over here.
Yeah, in the middle
Sorry.
range.
We'll have the reception, so if you have questions, what I'll actually ask everyone to do is allow the speakers to actually get out into the reception area before you ask them questions. But
Yeah, no mobbing.
This is just a personal question. Has your understanding of free will, do you feel like it's made you a better person?
Hell yes. I'm sorry. Yeah, go ahead.
Boy, that's a hard question. No, I think it's left me just where I always was.
Should we all say yes or no? The study that Al mentioned before about how learning about determinism makes you a thieving cheat. As somebody who's been very convinced by the science that we're less free than we thought we were, I don't know this from introspection, but I'm convinced by the research I must be a much worse person than I was before studying this topic.
Anything else about? Yeah, are you a better person?
I think I'm less quick to blame people because I am more conscious of how many factors go into determining our behavior. But that doesn't mean that I don't believe in free will.
Actually, studying almost anything philosophy that has done that to me. I'm much more careful now about pronouncements and especially about what other people are doing or saying. Anything else on that topic? And what about you? Okay.
I don't know whether it makes
You're neutral.
Can I add one more remark on this because it's kind of a take-home message, which is I don't think neuroscience is the place that poses the greatest threat to free will. Yeah, the mind turns out to be a mechanism that's fascinating and important, but that's not where we need to get nervous. The real threat to free will is social science. It's the discovery that the cultural environment we're in is driving our actions. All of us, when we go to vote, should think about whether the decision we're making is driven by our demography or by an actual careful reflection on the candidates, their positions, and so on. It's impossible to become a tabula rasa and take on these deep moral questions with no prior culturally inculcated values. But I think all of us could improve our performance in the world by not taking our most deeply held preferences as reflections of our knowledge, of reflections of our inner self. We should take them as products of our social environment, and we all have a responsibility to come to such decisions with exposure to as many possible sources of influence that could help us in arriving at actions that could be justified at the end of the day.
I'm going to wait before the clap, I'm going to exert my sense of free will and allow one more question.
Sure.
At the risk of the panel not liking me. Sorry.
As a young neuro-pseudoscientist myself, I'd like to ask a quick question of Jesse and
Did you
Al.
say pseudoscientist?
I did, and I think it's appropriate.
Okay.
I'd like to ask Jesse and Al, you had two very different interpretations of the original Libet experiment. If you could just flesh that out for me, I think it's very important where you're coming from and why you have those interpretations.
Was Al who discussed the Libet?
Oh, yeah, you mentioned
Did I
Libet a
mention
little
Libet?
bit. We didn't really, but there is one more thing to be said about it. Libet believed in what is sometimes called free won't. And Jesse mentioned this. So the idea is consciousness never initiates actions, but once you become conscious of your intention or urge or whatever, Libet thought you have the power to step in and veto it, so you can stop the process. And I think Jesse alluded to the veto power, and I didn't, but there was no disagreement. It was just sort of incompleteness. Yeah, so Libet thought you could stop the process. He didn't really have very good evidence for that. People are working on it now. There's some exciting work being done.
I mean, the Libet experiment, just quickly on this, I do think is very underwhelming in the sense that, as Al described it, people are asked to sit in a chair and wait till an urge comes along. And sure enough, the urge is preceded by an unconscious brain potential. And Al raised some worries about whether that brain potential is even the one that's driving the movement. But an urge is not exactly a paradigm case of a free action. So the very experiment is not designed to test something that we would consider a good expression of freedom. So I think we need much better studies, much better experimental designs if we're going to make progress on this question.
And on these lines, before we conclude, this is actually a very good example from my personal experience of what happens when you think about things from a scientific perspective or a philosophical perspective. When I actually first read about the Libet experiments, I was blowing my mind in terms of the potential implications. And then I started reading the philosophical literature about it. I said, actually, no, you're right. It's not such a big deal. The guy was actually, it's interesting, but it's not as momentous as most people still make it to be today.
There's a new book out, I guess came out last year, edited by Walterson and Armstrong and Lynn Nadell on, it's like 20 essays on the Libet experiments, and it will bring you up to date with everything people are thinking.
Of course, for anything you want to know, there is a book about it. With that, let me thank again our panel, Adina, Al, Hakwan, and Jesse, and thank all of you for coming tonight. Thank you.